Electric trams have had a fairly rough ride this century, and many people felt they gave a rough ride in return. Hailed at first as heroes of a bright, cleaner age, they quickly became associated with industrial grime and high-density populations. A few lines did stretch into the country, but tended to be few and far between. The tram simply got you from A to B. No one felt particularly attached to them, so they were hardly missed when swept aside by the new breed of buses and trolleybuses. A few undertakings kept faith, but the modern trams of the 30s failed to alter overall perceptions. By 1962, every traditional system had gone except for Blackpool. Then in the 90s, trams began to return in the form of light railways. Now they were seen as one way of solving increasing traffic congestion and pollution. For those advocates of electric traction, this resurgence has been long overdue. Back in 1900, it was horses, horses everywhere. One can almost smell the sweat and manure in these astonishing sequences taken on Glasgow Bridge. The horse tram was on its last legs, facing extinction from the coming electrical onslaught. As was happening elsewhere, Glasgow Corporation had exercised their legal powers to buy the assets of the tramway company, with a view to electrification, using their own locally produced power. The horse tram had literally been eating into the slender profit margins. Working expenses were far too high, averaging nearly 80% of receipts. A tram horse could work 4 to 5 hours a day for up to 5 years, by which time it would be fit only for the knacker's yard. The men too were knackered. They could be in harness 12 hours, 7 days a week in rain, snow and fog. Hence the need for temperance societies to caution against the excesses of the demon drink. The wage for a tram driver in 1900 was about £1 a week. As the Victorian era came to an end, the horse car operators knew their days were numbered. Speeds were slow and capacity limited by the motive power. The vehicles came in two basic sizes, small and large. These Manchester examples were of the heavier 2-horse variety. Weighing up to 2.5 tons, they could carry up to 22 in the lower saloon and up to 24 on the roof. In some places, like Manchester, competing wagonettes were challenging the slow-moving trams by charging lower fares. Progress was obviously essential. Some attempt had been made to cut costs by designing this reversible tram body, which eliminated the need for pole shifters. Although electric trams would require expensive fixed installations like overhead wires and power supplies, the working costs per mile would be much reduced, which in turn meant lower fares. A few horse trams lingered on. The last example in England ran in Morecambe until 1926. In Ireland, passengers alighting at Fintna Junction and heading for Fintna travelled along the 3/4-mile branch on board this ancient 1883 horse tram, which had originally been divided into 3 classes, third-class passengers occupying the knifeboard seats on the roof. Despite being loved as a national institution, the Fintna tram was stopped in 1957. Each successive horse took the name Dick, and because they all reacted badly to the noisy steam locos at the junction, they had a comforting retreat provided for them. Today, there is just one remaining horse-operated line. This runs every summer for 2 miles along Douglas Promenade on the Isle of Man, and provides us with a living memory of a form of transport which once dominated our towns and cities. Enjoying limited success at the end of the 19th century was the steam tram. This encompassed the two great bases of Victorian prosperity, coal and iron. At one point, there had been over 500 active locomotives. The trailers incorporated two major innovations. They rode on bogies, which allowed for more seats, and had top covers to protect passengers from the flying soot and ash. Both would later be adopted for electric trams. Because they were costly to operate and maintain, most became noisy and dirty, although supporters argued if properly looked after, they were in fact clean, smooth and relatively silent. In this sequence, filmed in Wigan, the driver may simply have doused the crowd for the benefit of the camera, or it could be a ritual send-off connected with the end of steam operation in the town. By 1909, the last of these urban monsters would have chugged into history. In San Francisco, little cable cars still climb halfway to the stars, whilst in Llandudno, Britain's last cable trams still wind up the Great Orme. Strictly, this is not a true cable tramway, because at Llandudno the cars are permanently attached to a moving cable controlled from an engine house. But it does provide us with a unique reminder of the country's handful of cable tramways, the largest of which survived at Edinburgh until the early 1920s. Although now discontinued, the trolley poles and overhead wires were formerly used for communication purposes. Walkie-talkie radios are now used today. England's oldest electric railway was opened at Brighton in 1883. Built by Magnus Voke, this pioneer line sparked into life the electric revolution, which eventually ousted the vast majority of horse and steam trams. Although somewhat altered, this unique line still runs today. Among the country's first electric tramways was the 3-foot gauge Manx Electric, opened in 1893. For over 100 years, the railway's exquisite Victorian trams have provided a tangible link with the earliest days of electrification. At Laxey, connection is made with the 3-foot 6-gauge Snaefell Mountain Railway, opened in 1895. Here, the third rail, or fell rail, provides additional braking, and it also keeps the cars on the track as they battle up to Snaefell summit in a variety of weather conditions. Blackpool had the distinction of opening the first electric street tramway in 1885. 100 years later, one of the original trams, now powered by batteries, recreated the early days of conduit operation. In this system, power was drawn by means of a plough from a conductor rail carried in an underground channel situated between the two running rails. After objections had been raised to unsightly overhead wires, London had one of the largest conduit systems in the world, the last sections of which were abandoned in 1952. Both trolleys are tied down on this tram because it was drawing power from the conduit. A fascinating ritual took place at the change pits, where the switch was made from overhead to conduit. Here, a plough shifter uses a plough fork to insert a plough. One of the earliest tramways to draw power from overhead wires ran along the Marine Drive on the Isle of Man. Their double-deck toast racks were unusual in having both staircases on one side only. When Liverpool first electrified its tramways, it imported cars from Germany and America. The developing British tramcar industry would rely heavily upon truck and motor designs developed in America and then incorporated into British-style double-deckers. Protective top covers would become the norm on many systems. This is Aberdeen. Transition time at Bradford Foster Square as steam gives way to electric. There now follows some wonderful turn-of-the-century journeys on various new electric tramways. The Blackburn-based firm of Mitchell and Kenyon simply mounted their camera on the front of a tram and recorded the passing scene in all its rich variety. For the horses, it would have been a strain tackling Bradford's many steep hills, which the new-fangled trams simply took blithely in their stride. Even 100 years ago, cameramen were up to tricks. Watch how this group of attractive young women are asked to walk past the tram again, but this time without looking at the camera. Rare film of a brand new junction being installed. With so little other road traffic, the works were avoided by means of a temporary third track. Today such work would probably bring the whole town to a standstill. This Yorkshire journey ends at Lister Park Gates. Halifax also abounded in hills, raising fears of a runaway. This driver is applying one of the many types of special brake fitted to all trams working on especially steep grades. Sheffield began electrifying its routes in 1899. These were fairly typical of early double-deckers, with their upper deck wooden seats reached by tightly angled staircases. In horse days, staff had worn their own clothes. Now they were provided with smart uniforms. Sheffield had opted for route letters instead of numbers. In later years, these would be dropped altogether. Trams even influenced women's fashions. For example, out went the cumbersome heavy skirts, which allowed for easier access to the upper decks. Many undertakings often had traction poles down the middle of the street. To the layman, trams probably all look alike, but orders would often be placed with different manufacturers. Some places employed young men to guide the trolley through busy junctions. Point boys were also hired to switch direction for an approaching tram. Later, automatic points would be installed. A range of single-deckers were built for likely traffic routes and those with low bridges. The wheel on the brake column was turned to apply various additional braking for the trams, particularly those descending severe grades, such as were encountered on the W Walkley route. On most major thoroughfares, there would always be a tram in sight. Frequently, they came in convoys. Blackburn and Darwin operated a joint service between the two towns. Shortly before the official opening, excited crowds watched the big high-capacity bogie cars with their offset trolley poles make various test runs. Southport was unusual in having corporation and company-owned trams sharing the same tracks. A Mitchell and Kenyon ride now through Nottingham, which electrified its trams in 1901. Many places developed a kind of tramway centre, complete with additional sidings and crossovers where people could change from one route to another. Nottingham would later introduce route letters. When separate tracks were laid in nearby streets for outbound and inbound cars, this was known as Cannon Hilling, after the Cannon Hill line in Birmingham, which ran in separate streets for nearly half its route. Wallasey, which electrified in 1902, eventually had 4 routes linking 2 common termini. Mitchell and Kenyon visited Lytham shortly after the opening of the company-owned tramway in 1903, when residents and visitors were anxious to taste the delights of electric traction. In many places, trams stimulated housing development. Existing property prices rose, and shops and hotels would be at pains to advertise their proximity to a new tram route. The film shows how much of the roadway surrounding the tram track was still unfinished. The section of the highway for which the tramway's company was responsible, namely the 18 inches on either side of the outer rails, is clearly visible. Side bracket arms have been used to support the overhead wires. Complicated agreements were drawn up over running rights. For example, the Lytham Company was initially confined to the fringes of Blackpool. Once served by steam trams, Rochdale's new electric system ran even further out into the country, some lines passing through sparsely populated areas on single track and passing loops. However, as the trams climbed above the smoke and grime of the town, so ribbon development occurred along the route. In 1906, over 150,000 new houses were built in Britain, largely because of expanding tramways. The narrow-gauge Leamington and Warwick system opened in 1905. This horse-drawn tower wagon was involved in a frenetic last-minute rush to complete the new tramway in Accrington before arrival of the Board of Trade Inspectors, who examined every aspect of a system prior to its public opening. They also set speed limits and imposed certain compulsory stops. Filmed in August 1907, this is the only known fully documented record of the opening of a British tramway. Thousands poured onto the streets to watch the parade. Single-deckers were needed by Accrington to pass under a low railway bridge on their Oswaldtwistle section. Included were visiting trams from both Blackburn and Darwin, all of which shared the same 4-foot gauge. Caught up in the euphoria surrounding the end of the town steam trams, no one could have predicted that within 10 years the first electric tramway at Sheerness would be scrapped, and that in 1931 a Royal Transport Commission would recommend that trams should be gradually phased out as they were inflexible, dangerous and a major cause of congestion. While some managements disregarded the commission, for the public the tram was all too quickly seen as obsolete. Up until the First World War, the tramcar industry was buoyant. For example, over 8,000 trams were built in Preston for the domestic and overseas market. Here, horses had to haul new electric trams through Preston to the depot because the system was not yet complete. Some new vehicles arrived in sections. These had come by rail from a factory in Manchester. To save money, corporations like Liverpool would eventually build their own trams in their own workshops. Glasgow had the last large-scale works in the country. When Copeland Hill closed its doors in 1962, a whole raft of skills was lost. Here the staff had built, repaired and rehabilitated hundreds of vehicles, including the city's famous standards, Kilmarnocks, Coronations and Cunadas. Many trams were known to staff and public by a range of names. Essentially urban in nature, there was little romance attached to the British tram, but they did have their lighter side. For example, some were dressed overall for special occasions, such as coronations. A few even became movie stars. Traction action in South London during a cops and robbers story. Stop! Follow that tram! Riding their electric steed with guns blazing, the law pursues the fleeing gangsters and their moles. The film ends with the inevitable fight to the death. Actors in Blackpool found an outing on the circular tour was one way of generating publicity. The white-coated inspector was clearly auditioning for the fat controller. The public really loved their illuminated trams. This one was filmed in Birmingham in 1937. Often trams would appear in the background of films taken by local cine clubs. This one at Finchley briefly recorded their illuminated tram. One great way to enjoy a seaside ride was on board an open toast rack. These 60-seaters delighted riders on the Llandudno and Colwyn Bay Electric Railway until 1955. This old-timer had been trundled out as part of the Aberdeen University Rag Week. Following in a great tradition, Blackpool still has a few trams which appear each year during the town's world-famous illuminations. Although new routes were opened right up until 1949, the real building boom was over by the start of the First World War. Later construction often involved the laying of private right-of-ways segregated from other road users. This was the Temple Newsam route in Leeds. British trams reached their peak in the mid-20s, with 14,500 vehicles operating over 2,600 miles of route. Now for a few oddities. During the First World War, the good people of Halifax could buy a reasonably priced meal from this travelling kitchen. In several places you could pop out and post a letter by tram. As snow was a particular hazard, most systems had special clearing equipment. One of London Transport's sturdy breakdown tenders pushes a disabled car. Much of this work was labour-intensive, the men braving the biting cold to unblock frozen points and bring in stranded cars. These scenes were filmed in South London during the bitter winter of 1947, when the capital still had some 800 trams. Generally, trams have a good safety record, but a few runaways did occur, sometimes with loss of life. This car had turned over after losing control on a steep hill in Liverpool in 1934. Britain's only tram subway was in London. It even had 2 subterranean stations. Another rag week, this time in Leeds. Works trams tended to be nocturnal by inclination. Some were purpose-built for tasks like rail grinding, whilst others were demoted passenger cars. This trio was captured ambling sedately through central Leeds. To maintain its 11-mile tramway, Blackpool still requires a mix of different work vehicles. The tram was ideal for shifting large crowds. Professional football clubs had blossomed during the 1890s, and with the reduction in working hours, the grounds became the target for thousands of men on a Saturday afternoon. A special storage siding was laid at Ellen Road, Leeds, for cars awaiting the final whistle. The ground could then accommodate some 57,000 fans. Across the city now to Headingley, with cricket supporters hurrying to board the waiting trams and buses. In Dundee, tickets were issued by roving conductors. These excited rugby supporters were en route to Murrayfield in Edinburgh. In the interwar years, headwear was common and few women attended big sporting occasions. By the late 20s, too many trams were both noisy and poor riding. Many were worn out as operators fought a losing battle against increasing decay. Words like groaning, roaring, rattling and clanking were used. Some trams did all of this, whilst also emitting a cacophony of strange sounds from the worn gears and loose brake rigging. Sometimes this was the result of deliberate neglect, as cash-strapped managements failed to maintain their cars and track. The new generation of buses and trolleybuses found a ready market. The big decline came in the 30s, when the number of trams was roughly halved. These are just a few of the systems to go. Wallasey in late 1933. The Portsmouth and Horndean Light Railway in 1935. Burnley also in 1935. Here the legendary general manager Henry Moseley had developed a highly successful smooth-riding bogie truck. However, the strident anti-tram propaganda of the time meant the last tram slipped away virtually unnoticed. Despite ordering new cars after the war, Warrington closed its last route in 1935, by which time the original car number 1 had been much rebuilt. Norwich rebodied many of its fleet during the 20s, but along very traditional lines. As in Norwich, people in Bournemouth had no top-deck covers. Here the corporation opted for the trolleybus, which was attracting increasing orders because of its high capacity, its quiet riding, and its consumption of locally produced electricity. Some Bournemouth trams did find a new home in Llandudno. Nottingham, which also favoured the trolleybus, sold some of its trams to Aberdeen. The delightful line linking Rothesay to Ettrick Bay closed in 1936. Dover too packed up the same year, by which time the corporation's mix of original and second-hand cars had clearly reached the end of the road. Coming next, a very brief glimpse of an Isle of Thanet tram. Lytham St Anne's closed in 1937, as did Weston-super-Mare, where the fleet included some four-wheel tow straps. Birkenhead, the birthplace of the tram, bowed out in 1937. Scrapped some years earlier were these former single-deckers, which it was said were so deafening they could be heard over a mile away. The Bath Electric Tramways Company survived until 1939, with an old-fashioned but well-maintained fleet, which included a handful of single-deckers. None of the fleet had vestibules or top covers. Brighton kept building brand new four-wheel open-top cars until just 2 years before trolleybuses finally replaced its trams in 1939. Despite of all these closures, money was spent on upgrading older trams during the 30s, and a few new, smooth-riding, totally enclosed bogie cars with upholstered seats, high-speed motors and air brakes were produced. The Feltham-class streamliners entered service in 1931. With their straight staircases and pleasant furnishings, they provided a welcome contrast with older London vehicles. Other advanced designs included the Leeds Middleton bogies. This progressive undertaking, which was committed to tramway modernisation, had also dropped the trolley in favour of the more efficient bow collector. Blackpool too invested in a fleet of rail coaches and streamlined double-deckers. Liverpool produced hundreds of fast modern trams between 1933 and 1942. Glasgow built the first of its famous Coronation class in 1937. When war broke out in 1939, there were still some 8,000 trams. These were to play a vital role in the nation's wartime infrastructure. As part of the blackout precautions, bumpers were painted white and mast headlights were fitted. To keep the trams running, special track work was tested, for example this ramp through which hose pipes could be threaded. These scenes were taken in Birmingham. As the war progressed, the remaining tramways suffered from chronic neglect. Several doomed systems won a temporary reprieve and a few routes were reopened. However, Huddersfield completed its trolleybus conversion programme in 1940. Following a devastating air raid, Coventry's remaining trams came to an abrupt halt in November 1940, following damage to feeder cables. Their last new trams are dated from 1931, and the last extension had opened as late as 1930. The bombing also ended tramway operation in Bristol. This was the famous tramway centre. Latterly, the whole operation had looked increasingly anachronistic. None of these predominantly Victorian vehicles had either top covers or vestibules. In winter, the drivers sought protection in heavy coats and gloves. Some even wore goggles. Interestingly, the use of these modern reversers meant conductors no longer had to swing the trolley in a busy main road. Service would cease abruptly on the 11th of April 1941, following bomb damage to the main power supply. There was a limited renaissance. Liverpool's last extension opened in 1944. Sunderland completed a mile of reserve track in 1949, but closed it 5 years later. Also keeping faith, Leeds finished its Middleton Circle in 1949. Aberdeen was among a handful of undertakings to introduce new trams after the war. 20 of these 76-seaters entered service in 1949. By far the largest number were built at Glasgow and included 100 bogie cars dating from 1948 to 52. Because of their tendency to roll, they were nicknamed Cunardas. Leeds introduced 2 modern single-deckers in 1953, the very year in which it was decided to scrap the trams. Blackpool purchased 25 Coronation single-deckers. Glasgow had the distinction of building the last new double-decker bodies. These were mounted on second-hand trucks from Liverpool. There had always been a ready market for offloading trams in working order. For example, Sheffield disposed of this type of single-decker to Barrow and Preston. Llandudno picked up bargains from Accrington and also Bournemouth. Examples of both types surviving until 1956. Sunderland had many second-hand cars, including cast-offs from Ilford and Huddersfield. Over the years, various London trams found new homes. However, in the early 50s, most were scrapped. But the capital's most modern tram, LCC Bluebird No. 1 of 1932, migrated north to Leeds, where it joined other imports from Manchester and Southampton. The biggest post-war sale saw 90 London Felthams go to Leeds. The final major transfer involved 46 Liverpool Green Goddesses, which went to Glasgow in the mid-50s. At the end of the war, 6,000 trams had remained, most living on borrowed time. The remnants of the run-down Salford system staggered on until March 1947. The war had interrupted Manchester's conversion programme. Now delays in delivering new buses and trolleybuses kept the war-weary trams in service until January 1949. 50 years later, modern trams are once again weaving through Piccadilly. These scenes were filmed in Blackburn in 1931, when the corporation also operated single-deckers. The last of the sturdy, smooth-riding double-deckers bowed out in September 1949. The compact Leicester system, where some cars dated back to 1904, had all gone by November 1949. Southampton's distinctive domed roof cars, designed to pass through the bar gate on the left, made their celebratory last journeys on New Year's Eve 1949. Cardiff's last trams had all gone by February 1950. They had an unusual pay-as-you-enter flat fare system and were largely replaced by trolleybuses. A few months later, the country's last 4-foot gauge tram ceased climbing Bradford's hills. The Gateshead and District Company trams outlived their Newcastle neighbours by over a year. Most routes were short and passed through classic industrial tramscapes. So did the local lines in Stockport. Although severed from the giant Manchester system for some 2.5 years, the last of the town's neat four-wheelers kept going until August 1951. London said goodbye to its trams in a blaze of nostalgia in July 1952. Having got rid of them, London transport would next turn against the trolleybus. Hundreds of additional diesel buses were now on the streets, and these contributed in no small way to the disastrous smog which killed over 12,000 people later in the year. The tall, thin, narrow-gauge Birmingham trams were speedy and well maintained. The last of their heavily used lines was replaced by buses in July 1953. Belfast had embarked on a trolleybus conversion programme in 1938. When the last shipyard workings ended in February 1954, much of its fleet was in poor shape. Sunderland bowed to the inevitable in October 1954, even though their new post-war extension had not even been paid for. One system should have survived the carnage. This was the delightful 3-foot 6-gauge line linking Colwyn Bay and Llandudno. Mounting costs, especially increased electricity prices, led the company to cease operations in March 1956. Dundee, the first of the Scottish strongholds, fell in October 1956. Although very much of the 20s in both style and operation, the corporation had considered new trams as late as 1953. Costs everywhere were rising, and most of the tramway undertakings, such as Edinburgh, were reporting heavy losses as operating and maintenance costs exceeded revenue, although often fares were kept artificially low. Also, since nationalisation of the electricity industry, local authorities were not so keen to retain electric traction. This sign warned other road users at a dangerous S-bend, over which tram movements were controlled by coloured light signals, that tracks would swing close to the curb. In 1951, Liverpool had claimed their trams were losing £500,000 a year. So this impressive system, for which there had once been such high hopes, ran its last liners and baby grands in September 1957. By now, trams were also blamed for causing congestion as private car ownership increased. Aberdeen too turned to the bus, closing all its post-war network between 1951 and 1958, after which the 9-year-old streamliners were set alight and burnt. Leeds had once entertained grandiose plans for central area subways worked by modern rail coaches, but following a change of policy, the last remnants of this once large system with its 400 cars finally came to a foggy end in November 1959. Also closed in 1959 was the magnificent 5-foot 3-inch gauge Hill of Howth line in the Irish Republic. Despite being the first passenger-carrying railway in the world, the historic 5-mile Swansea-Mumbles line was closed in January 1960. The 106-seater double-deckers were the largest trams in Britain. Sheffield, the last English city to operate conventional trams, has subsequently been among the first to reintroduce light rail operation. The first generation tramway closed with due celebration in October 1960. Built by the Great Central Railway, these were the only trams operated by British Railways. They made their final journeys ferrying workers to and from the docks at Immingham in July 1961. This was the highest number ever carried by a British tram. The tram was now an endangered species. Even Glasgow was fully occupied converting its dwindling empire. Here are just a few images of the country's last great city tramway, which finally passed into history, watched by 250,000 people on a wet day in September 1962. In the mid-60s, even Blackpool was faced with extinction, but wiser counsels prevailed and the promenade line is still hard at work. Although much rebuilt, some of the cars have clocked up 60 years of service. There are also various newer trams. The resort also plays host to a number of vintage vehicles, which form a vital part of Britain's transport heritage. This veteran, which started life on the Blackpool and Fleetwood tram road, was built by Milnes in 1898. Equally delightful Milnes cars can be found in regular use on the Manx Electric Railway. Various museums also have collections of cars. At the National Tramway Museum at Cryche in Derbyshire can be found representatives of some of the major tramway manufacturers: Brill, Brush, Dick Kerr, Hurst Nelson, Mailey & Taunton, English Electric, EMB, to name but a few. The Black Country Museum in the Midlands has a short internal line. At Birkenhead, trams operate through a section of the former dock estate. A service is also provided along part of an original corporation route which ran into Heaton Park, Manchester. A circle totally encompasses the North East Open Air Museum at Beamish. At Carlton Colville near Lowestoft, there is also another short line. For those who prefer their things in miniature, A narrow-gauge tramway runs for 3 miles along part of the former railway branch to Seaton in Devon. Since the 1970s, there was a growing realization in Britain that perhaps the continent was right and light rail did have a role to play. The first modern system to open was the Tyne and Wear Metro in 1980. This was followed by the Docklands Light Railway. Currently, this network is in the process of being extended yet again. The first of the tram-like systems was opened in Manchester in 1992. It even includes sections of street running and has proved so popular that a new extension is about to open. Since their inauguration, controversy has dogged the new Sheffield trams, especially over the vexed question of funding. The trams also failed to attract sufficient riders. However, now they are in new hands, improvements are being made, and the future looks far more optimistic. The latest addition to the growing light rail map is the Midland Metro, opened this year. It is doing excellent business between Birmingham and Wolverhampton. Now an extension has been approved. Waiting to round off the century and ring in the new is Croydon Tramlink, which will reintroduce trams to the London area after a gap of nearly 50 years. With a commitment from government and local authorities, the wheel could come full circle, and the 21st century may yet see the tram come back into its own. Only time will tell.